Hello everyone, welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea Hiott. I'm glad you're here. Today is a really special conversation which I had quite some months ago, back in February I think, with a writer that's one of my favorite, Philip Ball. He is a science writer, a British science writer. He used to be the editor at Nature too for over 20 years. He's trained as both a chemist and a physicist, and he's written a lot of really good books. Critical Mass was a prize-winning book, and H2O, The Music Instinct. And the one we're talking about here is How Life Works. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. It comes at a moment when I think biology is really shifting. I mean, it's a shift that's been going on for a while, but it's really at an important moment now where this mechanistic gene-first story that we've been telling, you know, the one that says you are your genes, you are your DNA, the selfish gene, that whole idea is really changing a lot. The idea of the body as a machine assembled from the bottom up, that story is coming apart. But it's interesting because we don't want to just flip to the opposite, to not reject all of that came before. That's what this book is doing that's so interesting, and also this conversation. I think you'll hear it. We're trying to hold a certain tension, because even though that story is coming apart about the selfish gene and you are your genes and all of that, it's not that everything is wrong about that. So it's not, the hope is not to flip into the opposite, but rather to hold the tension and to really open up a new space about how we actually think about what life is and what we are. And we actually can do that now. We have more ways to communicate and more ways to study this that can help us get more rigorous, even as we also open up. So that's what we're trying to do in this conversation. It gets a little bit messy. That's a word I'm always using, but in a good way, because we're trying to talk about a lot of very hard things here, and we're also trying to talk about them in a way that isn't the old way, the usual way. And you'll hear that Philip is really very articulate about this. He's even better in the book, so I really highly recommend it. Also, he's written some very beautiful essays, and one of them, which is in Nautilus, is about how at the end of this book, when he was writing this book, he got diagnosed with cancer. And we get to that by the end of this conversation because he's come through well. He had surgery. All is good. It's all gone. But there was a time when it was very tense for him, and he was writing this book about life. So can you imagine? He was really having these questions pressed on him directly as he had been thinking about life and really trying to understand what it was. There's something very moving about that. And what he came to through this was that we are made of this material that's changing all the time, but you know what persists? And there are these patterns that come through us or are in the world with us, or that we create and give to the world that then are sort of going on without us. And it's not that they're floating around in the air or anything. It's that they're literally, you know, I can read this book again that he wrote, and there's an imprint to the book that changes me. And that will continue even in 100 years when people read the book. It's the same with music. It's the same with everything we create and do. But it's also the same with conversations that you just have with one another, because we change each other as we do that. And those patterns continue on in further conversations that those people have. So we end up in a place a little bit like that. And it's very interesting that can come from a very scientific conversation and also from a very scientific book. And I think one thing about Philip is he's really good at holding that. In the book, he talks about meaning, which is not a word you see often in a very scholarly biological book, but he does it with real rigor and grace. And I think that is such a gift at this moment. So I'm very happy to bring you this conversation and to share his work with you. And I'm really grateful that he spent some time with me. And thanks for being here. I hope that this conversation gives you something that helps you carry on these patterns that connect in some way that's meaningful for you today. Okay. All right. Hi, Philip. It's so wonderful to have you on Love and Philosophy today. Thank you so much for being here.
That was a pleasure. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about this wonderful book, How Life Works. One of the best things I've read in a long time. But to get us started, I was thinking about this idea of it's all in the genes, this kind of common thing that I hear a lot of people say still. What do you think about that sentence, it's all in the genes?
Yeah, we hear it again and again. I sort of see it almost daily, that it's in our DNA. It's a sort of cultural trope that we've got. And it worries me, frankly, because, we say it quite lightly, but underlying it is a sense that actually what's in our genes or what's in our genome somehow defines us. And that's the message that increasingly these mail order companies that offer to sequence your DNA like to encourage, that they will tell you all kinds of things about you, including these sort of ancestry charts, which really have very little meaning, but they play into certain cultural ideas that I think are worrying. But also, they'll tell you things about your personality and so forth. I've just reviewed a book, actually. This just occurs to me about a very, very nice book by Alison Bashford about chiromancy, analyzing the hand, analyzing, reading your palm, and how, and she follows this story through from the sort of ancient practices, the traditional practices, ideas of magic and so on, through to sort of modern analyses that get into genetics. And it makes the case very nicely that, this is the kind of old idea that we're now wanting to invest in our genome, that this somehow tells us deep truths about ourselves. So I wanted to challenge that. I think if you speak to pretty much any geneticist, they will say, well, yeah, that's a simplification. It's not really like that at all. They'll recognize that. But I think the messages that have gone out, particularly from things like the Human Genome Project, really suggested otherwise and have given rise to this sort of tendency for people to imagine that we are somehow defined by our genomes. What I wanted to do in the book was to explain why modern biology makes that idea no longer tenable, and to try to find better ways of thinking about the relationship between our genomes, or what scientists call our genotype, basically our, the unique sequence of chemical letters in this DNA and in the DNA that we have, the relationship between that and our actual selves, our actual traits, or what they call the phenotype. And that relationship is very, very complex. So, it is absolutely clear that there are aspects of people's traits that can be correlated with particular sequences in our genome. So people who have a particular variants of genes might tend to show statistically certain kinds of traits that other people don't show. So, there is a relationship between the genotype and the phenotype, but it's very hard to unravel what that relationship is. And in particular, it's hard to say exactly what our genes are doing in building us. And what I'm suggesting in the book is that, in fact, when we look at the way cell biology, molecular biology, developmental biology have progressed, particularly over the last 2 or 3 decades. In fact, since the completion of the Human Genome Project, um, we can see that any simple one-to-one relationship or any linear relationship between genotype and phenotype has become untenable, and that in fact there seems to be no privileged layer within the whole system of the whole hierarchy of structures in biology, from genes to molecules to cells to tissues to organs to organisms, and even beyond that into the ecosystem, that there is no privileged layer that determines the way an organism or an individual is, that we have to think about all those processes in their context, and that includes in the context of the lives we lead from, even before we were born. And I try to sort of explain how those different levels do what they do, and how there is a constant interaction and connection between these different levels, a flow of information between them. And in fact, when we think about, certainly about how complex organisms like us work, that is the only way we can work. That our bodies, our cells, and ourselves have to be responsive and adaptive to our circumstances, to our context. We couldn't survive otherwise. And what's interesting to me is how evolution has set up these systems to enable that to happen, to enable us to be these, what I would think of as open informational systems that can use contextual information and can feed it, back down even to the level of our genome to turn on or turn off certain genes in response to the environmental signals. So it's a very complex process how that is happening, but what it absolutely shows is that it's not a bottom-up process, that everything isn't being determined by our genes.
I think this is really hard for a lot of us to really take in because we want this mechanistic notion or idea of how everything works, of how life works. We want to understand it as sort of linear and that we can find the answers and that there's things will keep working the way they work. We can just see what's happening and then that's what's going to always be happening. And you're introducing what's really the case, which is a kind of messiness, even almost a sort of tension between things like what you just raised, opening and closing in terms of systems and so forth, or even where it matters where we're looking from, what we're going to see in terms of all of those things. So how is this different from that mechanistic worldview that a lot of us still really want to believe in, but also how is it not just kind of anything goes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the brilliant questions. I mean, that really is the key point of the book, that when as we come to understand this complexity in biology, it becomes more and more clear that we cannot think about it in terms of machines. That's been our tendency. It's always been our tendency, right back to early modern times when science began, or probably even before in some ways, but certainly at that time, the mechanistic philosophy, really, the mechanical philosophy of people like Descartes and Newton, that idea was that everything is machine-like and we have to understand it that way. And what I'm saying in the book is that there is no machine we have ever made that works in the way we can see we work. So the machine analogy is unhelpful. It encourages us to think in terms of components that sort of fit together rigidly and deterministically, and that is not the way we work, and it cannot be the way we work, because any machine that has the complexity that we do, if it worked that way, like clockwork, with every bit having to be in place, it simply would not function. It could not function. At the level of molecules and cells, it is unavoidably messy, because everything is sort of moving about, everything is moving about by diffusion, it's all shaking around, that you cannot guarantee that all the molecules in one cell will be in the same position as they are. In fact, you can guarantee that they will not be in the same position as they are in any other of our, billions and billions of cells. So you have to have some way of making things work that isn't sensitive to those fine details. And that's what biology has found, and it's found it by not using this sort of machine approach that we use. So that's really the challenge, because we've thought about life in these mechanistic terms for so long. It feels, if we relinquish that, and I think this is what some biologists even explicitly say, if we relinquish that, how else do we make sense of it? Because then it just looks messy, like you say, it just looks kind of chaotic. But I'm wanting to suggest in this book that actually we can, relinquish that and still find generic principles that seem to work, and that seem to give, robustness at the level of the organism. So, we live all these years despite all this sort of messiness. And in fact, and it makes sense that evolution would do this. Biology is using that messiness, and so I like to think. I mean, the question really is: so what metaphors are better than the machine metaphor? And I would suggest there are some, and they're usually metaphors. In fact, invariably metaphors that come from life itself. We shouldn't be thinking about things we make. We should be thinking about, how life works. So I think, for example, that it makes sense to think of the way a cell works more in cognitive terms than in machine-like terms. And by that, I don't mean that cells have a consciousness or an awareness, although there are people who would suggest that, but I don't think it's necessary to invoke that. But what I mean is, it's more like the way our brains work, in the sense that cells can somehow take in and integrate many different sources of information, and out of those come up with decisions, literally decisions that are robust and reliable and are the appropriate decisions for the context. And the way I think about that in molecular terms is more that molecules work not like little cogs and machine-like components. It's like committees. We make committees because we know what humans are like, that not everyone is going to be there. Not everyone is going to be paying attention. Some people will be stuck in traffic. But nevertheless, as long as you've got a committee that's kind of quorate and that enough people are paying attention and you have a good discussion, you can come up with a decision that hopefully is a good decision. That is, to my mind, that's exactly how cells work and exactly how the molecular systems in cells work, that it's a collective process. I mean, it's a great time to be having this discussion. Just yesterday, I got an email from a team, a very high-powered team, working on how our genes are regulated, how they're switched on and off. And it was a fantastically encouraging email. They've just published a paper in Science, and the team leader said, what I said in my book was really sort of anticipating what they found. That they had to, in order to make sense of this incredibly complex molecular process of switching a gene on and off, which involves many different components. They found they had to relinquish the old habitual ways of thinking for molecular biologists of machine-like components and think there's something emergent from this. It's a collective process where the decision that is being made is happening at that higher level. It's really happening, as I would think of it, at the committee level rather than at the level of, this molecule speaking to this one, speaking to this one. So it's very encouraging to hear things like that, to see that this way of thinking seems to be useful for making sense of biological complexity.
That's so exciting. I'd love to read that paper. I think we've arrived at a time where maybe we can handle this a little bit. As you say somewhere in the book, or maybe, as you just hinted to, a lot of scientists have known this forever, but they keep using the mechanism kind of orientation for the reasons you just said, but also because we can't handle it, but also because, as you also say, a lot of biology has been trying to run away from notions of this kind of contextuality, which ends up looking like meaning and teleology when we try to talk about it in metaphors. How do you see that connection? And maybe we could talk a little bit about why biology has been so afraid of words like meaning. I remember when I was doing my neuroscience degree, you couldn't really talk about purpose is probably the better word, which is all these words are connected, but that was sort of, you're not supposed to talk about purpose. You're supposed to just do the science, that mechanistic kind of science. So maybe how does that fit in with what you're saying here and where we are now in terms of this shift that we're making towards more contextual or community or committee based or committee like science?
It's a very odd situation in biology that on the one hand, many leading biologists have always acknowledged that organisms, at least, are purposeful entities, that they have goals. So this is something that the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr acknowledged. He's one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. It's something that Jacques Monod, who is a molecular biologist, again, one of the most influential molecular biologists of the late 20th century, he also said, we have to recognize all living things, without exception, he said, have goals. They're driven by goals. So this is in the nature of organisms, and it's not incidental. It is actually almost definitive of what organisms are. They are entities with goals. And maybe we'll come back to that, because I think we forget how extraordinary that is, that such things have arisen in the universe. But that is the nature of them, and we can see this all the time. I mean, it seems unproblematic for us and for a lot of biologists to say, well, of course we have goals, we do things. And if we think about often the way that's sort of dealt with in biology is to say, well, those goals are set by evolution, so our goals are to reproduce and to survive. But if we think about the things we do, I mean, us having this conversation now, it's not obvious that those are the drivers of what we're doing now. And most of what we do, probably, almost the majority of what we do day to day, those goals are not forefront. We have proximate goals that we set. I want to do this. I want to make a cup of coffee because I'm feeling thirsty. Obviously it's related to sort of, instinctive functions, but the decision itself is a proximate one. I'm suggesting because I think it's absolutely clear that certainly all complex organisms work that way. If we think of other primates, if we think of cats and dogs, if we think of birds, they're all doing this. They're all setting themselves proximate goals. But actually, I think we can see that tendency all the way through the living world. You can even think about plants. In fact, you can, do experiments where plants are clearly somehow responding to goals, responding in a goal-directed way. So this is absolutely central to the nature of living things. But biologists have been very nervous about it because when you start talking about goals, that really is teleological. There's no getting away from that. But they worry because for various reasons, that it's going to seem like there's something mystical going on, and that it seems to play into notions, and it can be very easily abused, of course, by people who want to argue for things like intelligent design, and that there is some sort of grand design and some intelligence behind all of this, which I don't want to dismiss that idly, because there are some very profound thinkers who have argued that way. But obviously, what we tend to come across is the very superficial way of thinking about that in terms of creationism and intelligent design and so forth. And understandably, biologists are very nervous about that. But I think that what that has given rise to is a kind of reactive sense that, well, we can't, as you say, Andrea, we can't, we just can't use those words because, that is what we're sort of invoking. And I think that's a real shame, because if we don't use those words, we are not talking about the nature of living systems. We have lost sight of what life is. And I'm really always struck by something that the molecular biologist Francois Jacob said in 1973. Jacob was one of the people who, along with Monod, did the crucial work in understanding gene regulation. So, his work, I mean, he's a Nobel laureate. He said in 1973, the thing is, biologists no longer study life. What an extraordinary thing to say. But what he meant was life is too hard to understand. It's too complex a phenomenon. So the decision has been made in biology to break it down, and to break it down for him into the molecules, and to understand the molecules. And in fact, I think it was Jacob also who said, that's the way biologists now work. We try to understand what biological systems do from the structure of their molecules, by looking at what were considered to be the components. When you do that, you have lost sight of life itself. But it's a pragmatic approach, because we can make progress that way, and we have made enormous progress that way. That's what I wanted to explore in my book. But I feel we are now at a stage, because of that progress, precisely because of it, we're at a stage where we can start putting the bits back together, and we can start asking those bigger questions of, so how do all these, I won't say parts because that's machine-like, but these components, these entities, how do they work together to create entities that have goals, and that not just have them, but they're not always programmed goals. They're goals that the entity sets in the moment, in its context, in response to what's happening to it. How does that work? That's the question that I think we're now ready to really start exploring. And that's really the central question for living things.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And it's so exciting too, in the spirit of messiness, because this brings up so many things. Let me just try. There's a few things that I really want to talk about in what you brought up. The first is this kind of ambiguity or tension that we're learning how to hold. It's almost like we're going to open to the ambiguity. We're opening up in a way, in the sense we've been sort of talking about, so that we can be more precise about what we're actually studying, which means maybe thinking of, as in the book, you show that proteins, for example, are floppy and strange forms, and it's not always these clear-cut kind of things, even what a molecule is or what, they are when we're studying them. So we're starting to like at least acknowledge that this is very messy, but also there's a kind of precision in that of, well, now we have to really say what we're actually assessing and studying. In the book, you say very clearly that like evolution you're not saying evolution has a purpose, because for me, that's like at the modeling level. We've called something kind of evolution, and then if we say that has a purpose, then we've gone to a different place. But when we're assessing a goal in a particular situation, when we're trying to understand something, as we've also noted, that doesn't mean that's always going to be the same goal and it's always going to work that way. You see, this is kind of messy, but I'm trying to get into how we can feel like there's a computational explosion in terms of what we could study and what we could know. And that's why we go to these mechanistic models and we try to focus on these very distinct things. But as we open up and as we let this ambiguity come, we have to find a new kind of precision.
Yes, okay. I think I see what you mean, and I absolutely do want to sort of reiterate that point that I see no reason to suppose that evolution itself has any sort of goal or purpose. Some people have argued that maybe there is a directionality to it. I'm agnostic about that. I see no reason to invoke that. I think what evolution is, what evolution does is it produces goal-directed entities. That's where, that's the mechanism by which we get them. And it's the only mechanism we know of by which we get them. We might be able to eventually do something like that ourselves, but only because we're, entities of that sort to begin with. So yeah, it's important to make that clear. I guess this question of messiness, it's the one that in the end we inevitably have to deal with, because every living entity is unique in what it's doing at any one moment, and yet somehow we need, because this is what science does, to have generic ways of understanding them. So even at the level, like I said, of our cells, the state of no cell is going to be exactly the same as any other cell in terms of exactly what molecules it contains and where they are, and yet somehow some cells do things in a particular way. Our skin cells are all, in some sense, recognizably skin cells and distinct from our neurons. And so, that's the question we need to understand. And the same with species. No animal is identical to, any other animal. And if you give a whole set of seemingly sort of identical animals, from the same species, a particular stimulus, they won't all respond in the same way. Even individual cells won't necessarily do that. Cells that look like they're just a clonal population, they're all clones of each other. You give them a stimulus, some will do one thing, some will do another. Why is that? And how does any kind of regularity and reliability come from something that seems to be so capricious, I suppose? So that's really the question. Those are the questions we're now looking at, and we've got to that point because we have mechanisms, we have methods for studying individual cells now, and for finding out exactly what molecules are in them and where those molecules are, and so we can really start to see these distinctions. And what it means is that we have to be recognizing that there are higher level questions that cannot depend, and clearly do not depend, on those fine details. So to my mind, that means we have to start thinking in terms of where is the causation in these systems, the causation that is giving rise to, skin cells developing in a particular place on an embryo at a particular time. There's an element of that is clearly genetic, but there are other things going on as well. And those things in general, I think, are the high level interactions between the components of the system. So, for cells are speaking to each other in a developing embryo all the time. And those conversations are determining what a particular cell will become, whether it will decide to become a skin cell or whatever. It's from its context. And so, I think this is really the general question that we want to understand in understanding living things, the contextuality of it, and how do we make systems that are able to respond, in a contextual way. And there, I think what seems to be happening is in the same way as we respond to our context, we cannot do it by a set of absolutely rigid rules. That's not going to work. We have to improvise. We have to, be kind of inventive, really, about it. We have to innovate sometimes, and those characteristics have to be built into living systems at a very deep level. And we don't have theories and concepts for really understanding that the nature of entities of that sort, entities that can innovate, entities that can improvise, entities that can work by kind of rules of thumb. And again, this is why I think it's useful to think in cognitive terms, because we don't really understand how our brains do that either, but clearly they do, and we are getting understanding of that. It's not like we're completely in the dark. But it requires a whole new set of ways of thinking, of principles that are quite different from bottom-up principles.
Yes, I love that you bring up cognition because I think a lot of scientists, philosophers, a lot of people are trying to change the way we assume that word to be something in the brain, in the head, in a human, and to be more about maybe the way I mean, this is my terms, but the way we make our way through as bodies, how we kind of deal with what we encounter or whatever, being something very, very basic in a way, and that could manifest itself in many ways. I mean, you've written about this in a very beautiful way in terms of what we could think of as minds, but to try to stay with this idea, we started with the gene, and that's usually thought of as a blueprint. And what I heard you just saying is more this flexible nature of, where we're not trying to make a blueprint, but we're trying to make something that's flexible such that, let's just say it's in a landscape and it's moving through that landscape, and whatever it's going to encounter, it can be flexible and change. You talk about promiscuity a little bit, and that just means it has a kind of more options than just some kind of program blueprint that it's working on at the level of the cell maybe, but we could think of this at other levels too. And that seems to get more into something maybe we should talk about too, which the gene itself is not even, I mean, it's very important, but you talk about proteins and RNA, and there's so many exciting things that we haven't really focused on that are so important. And it becomes more in the sense of context about the regulation of that, of this body is trying to kind of deal with what it encounters. How is that being sort of regulated in terms of that committee? Does that make any sense at all? Or do you
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
talk a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, it does, and I think that regulation is the key is the contextuality of it, and what that means is that we have to have systems from the gene regulation, machinery or mechanism upwards. We have to have systems that can integrate many sources of information, can bring them together, and somehow from all of that different information come up with a decision of what action to take, whether this gene should be switched on or off, whether I should run or whether I should freeze or whatever. And with that notion comes the notion of meaning, of making meaning. And this is, so this is an even more, I mean, you sort of said this is an even more contentious word in biology than purpose. To start talking about meaning, oh my God, isn't that getting into something really mystical? But I think that actually, at some fundamental level, what living systems are makers of meaning. And here's what I mean by that. That the information that we're getting all the time and the information that our cells are getting, there's so much of it. There is so much going on in our environment. Some of that is going to be useful information to us or to our cells. Some of it is going to be useless information. And so we're necessarily making judgments about the meaning, about the value of that information, and what does that information imply for what I should do in this context. It's very hard. It's always dangerous, but it's very hard to get away from anthropomorphizing the situation. But that's what I'm going to do at the moment.
Well, our language is
Imagining
kind of built
yourself.
around that, so it's very
Yeah.
hard.
How does that work? I mean, some of it is taken care of by evolution. Evolution has decided, for example, for us that it's not useful for us to attend to the information that comes at us from infrared radiation in our environment. we are sensitive, our eyes are sensitive to the visible spectrum by definition. So we don't attend to infrared. Some animals do. They have infrared sensors because that information is, useful, is meaningful to the particular context, the particular lifestyles they have. Some organisms like bees, can see ultraviolet radiation that we can't. So, that's kind of fixed by evolution. If you like, we've already learned through evolution that some things are worth attending to and some things are not. But, even given that level of filtering, we have to do immediate filtering ourselves. We have to decide, is this thing that I'm hearing something that is a warning signal that I should be aware of, or is it just background noise that I can screen out? So, this is, and cells are in a similar situation. And so there are judgments, if you like, judgments about the meaning of contextual information that we're getting, and we have to have systems that are able to make those judgments. And I feel that there is actually a continuity between that very low level, you could say sort of basal meaning making that individual cells and bacteria are doing, um, and the kind of meaning that we talk about colloquially. Is this book going to be meaningful to us? They're not different things. It's just we have an incredibly sophisticated elaboration of that same sense of meaning that happens at the lowest level. Because we have these complicated lifestyles, we have to have these nuances of meaning. What's really interesting also about that is that at some point between bacteria and us, and no one knows what the point is, and there's no agreement about it, but at some point, those judgments about meaning became valenced and became emotionally valenced. That meaning started to make the organism feel a certain way. And it's a very plausible idea about the development of minds and the development of emotions, that was an adaptive response. That once you have an emotional response, it kind of, as we recognize in our daily lives, it kind of focuses your attention. That actually this particular thing is making me feel bad. I don't like it. And so I'm going to attend to that and make that a key component of my decision, or that it makes me feel great. So, I think this is a very reasonable idea for why an emotionality arose at some point in connection with meaning making.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. You mentioned affordances a few times and things like that. I wonder if because we have all these different nested scales, and then we also have this continuity. And even the way we're talking, we're still talking as if there's like some sort of ladder that we're going up and down, which is actually what you're kind of exploding a bit in the book. And what a lot of us are trying to think through multiplicities or constellations, or instead of this, one or the other kind of thing. But you talk about like purpose being intrinsic, and sometimes you talk about even meaning being life itself in a sense, but you say, it's built in. But I wonder if you even think of it as more radical than that ever, where in an ecological psychology kind of way, where it's literally what's happening in contact with bodies and bodies. And that at some point we develop a way to, as you said, become attentive to that and even know that we're feeling in a panskip kind of way, or maybe Mark Solms kind of way. But I just wonder, have you thought about that, like more immediacy? Because sometimes I feel it in the book that you're actually trying to almost say, this is the action of this. But the way we use words, it ends up sounding like this has this action.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, when we think about how this relates to embodiment, it I absolutely think it's clearly in the nature of living things that they have an embodiment, that they are embodied, they are not disembodied information. There's a big discussion now about how central that is to the notion of minds, whether they have to be embodied minds. I think it's unambiguous for living systems that the particular embodiment they have is an aspect. It doesn't just condition the sort of mind they have. It is an aspect of the kind of mind they have that actually. The neuroscientist Anil Seth has talked about this. That the decisions we make, the our mental world is conditioned by what we think we can do as embodied creatures, that we can go round behind something and take a look at it. And so we sort of imagine, the world from that perspective. We don't have the kind of embodiment that allows us to imagine, well, what is it going to look like if I was flying, or, if I, whereas, a bird does have that, it will have a different mental landscape because of its different embodied nature. So that's absolutely central. There's also, I think, very plausibly, the idea that another thing emotions are doing, and it's related to what I spoke about, is that it is the body telling the brain what's going on for the body, that emotions are embodied. And I mean, the fact that that is so deeply embedded in the way we talk about them in the first place, about our language. I felt it in my gut, I felt it in my heart, and you kind of do.
Which is also part of the nervous system. I mean, even that,
Yes.
thinking of brain and body as different, or assuming that in our language, these are not different either. And the nervous system, as you know, I mean, just it's big, it goes through the body, so it's even just
Yeah,
to
well,
know that.
that's why I find it, really useful to remind ourselves that the brain is not the kind of computational center of the body. The brain is an organ in the body, and it's an organ that has particular functions, amazing functions, but it's an organ. So, it's part of the body. So, yes, absolutely. I think that's, really important to recognize. And, it seems quite likely that the brain the central nervous systems could well have been. This is what Peter Godfrey Smith has talked about, that they could have they could have arisen from different bodily necessities. So that partly they were to do with sensing. That we started off being able to sense, to take in information, but we also needed a central nervous system to control these big bodies that early animals began to have. And those two are separate processes that at some stage literally connected up, and you have something like a brain that is, in some sense, a controlling aspect of the body, but is also part of the body. It's very hard to sort of talk properly about it because we have these long traditions of the mind body duality and so on. It's really hard to get away from. So yeah, I think that embodied nature of organisms is absolutely central to what they're doing, how they're behaving, how they're collecting information in the first place, their tactile senses and so forth. That we have the mental sense of what our body is doing, and that's absolutely crucial for being able to conduct ourselves in the world. So I'm very keen on what seems to be happening with in neuroscience now, of this much more embodied notion of what minds are and how they work.
Yes, there's a lot of generative stuff that can come from your book, for example, and neuroscientists reading this. But also this idea of body, as you just raised it, then we start to notice that there's many bodies within bodies. You talk about that nestedness, because we're talking about cells, we're talking about human bodies in this conversation. And all of these are also nested within each other. And they're also a little bit distinctions we're making so as to try to understand all of this ongoing process, which I'm just trying to open it back up to that contextual view that I think is so important in your work, and the idea of meaning itself being this regulation, right? That's happening at so many different levels. The cells in the body are regulating, but that's also regulating the body. It is very hard to hold all of this, as we said. And that's why it's good to have these kind of conversations where we try. But he'll try to link this to the meaning, or even, I don't know if you would say mattering, if that word's going too far, but we've talked about how we can be so open and almost kind of promiscuous in terms of there's a lot of possibilities. But another really important part of the book, I think, is the collaboration, which, that already sounds like a coming together, a fidelity. And I wonder how you think about that sort of tension of committees caring. I'm using the word caring. I don't know what you think about that. We can talk about it in a minute, but communities having the same kind of meaningful system, right? So that they're in concert, right, towards something. I wonder how that sense of collaboration or fidelity fits for you, or how you've thought about it with this other sense of being flexible and open.
Okay, the lot of things there I wanted to touch on. I mean, first of all, the notion of thinking about these molecular committees or these cellular committees as caring. I think that's a perfectly reasonable term to use because I've kind of said it already in the sense that there are value judgments being made. How much do I care about this particular signal? How much should I care? That's exactly what they're what these committees are having to think about. So yeah, I think it's a perfectly reasonable word to use, so long as we recognize what we mean by it. And there may be an emotional valence attached to that, or there may not be, depending on the kind of organism you're talking about. But the question of collectivity is an interesting one, and here I feel like I tend to approach it, and this may be a kind of rather sort of clinical or technical way to approach it, but it's the way that makes sense to me. I approach it from my background as a condensed matter physicist. And this is the thing that, in fact, I'm writing about it at the moment. The next book is going to be about this because
Oh, wonderful.
it frustrates me so much that the notions we have about physics are about physics being about looking at more and more sort of fundamental forces and particles, and somehow we're going to get to the deep questions by understanding it at this, it's you could say at this reductionist level. Now we need that, that reduction we need to sort of truly understand what the things that make atoms are made of, what the fundamental forces of nature are. We absolutely need that. But so much of physics has been about collectivity. And this is not sort of recognized. And it is this area of condensed matter physics, as it's now called, which is basically the physics of stuff, of real stuff that is tangible, of liquids, of solids, of gases, of lots of things interacting with one another, because that is the nature of the universe. It's full of stuff interacting with each other. And what's so fascinating, and we've known about this in some sort of deep sense since at least the middle of the 19th century, with work of James Clerk Maxwell and Ludwig Boltzmann. We've known that there are rules to this sort of collectivity. There is a regularity. There are regularities that emerge from collectivity, and it's a regularity that does not depend on what the individual components are. It doesn't strongly depend on them. So we find exactly the same kinds of behaviors and rules emerging from liquids condensing to gases, evaporating to gases, and gases condensing to liquids, as we find in systems, in magnetic systems, where there's lots of atoms that are magnetic interacting with one another. The similarities in their behavior are extraordinary, even in mathematical quantitative detail. There are particular sort of times where we see, you can map one onto the other, and yet they look like totally different systems. So there's a deep kind of what physicists say, universality to collective behavior. It's a universality that now we're starting to recognize in many other places that physics hasn't gone before. So for sort of 20 or 30 years or so now, we've thought about, or urban planners have thought about traffic this way. Traffic is a system of many bodies interacting, and they're interacting in quite simple ways. Even though the drivers might be thinking about all sorts of things, the rules are quite simple. You don't want to crash into the person in front, so you'll slow down if you need to, as if there's a force of repulsion that is sort of slowing you down, and we can think about it that way, even though it's not a real one we can measure. That's kind of it. Those are the rules. And so, we see in traffic, it will sometimes, if it's above a certain density, it might condense into a sort of fluid-like flow where everything is flowing, but it's all moving together. And it might condense further into a solid, and it's a jam. And, the same principles are applying. So there is this collectivity about the behavior of things that is really quite universal. We see the same behavior, and it's a collectivity that doesn't depend on the individual components doing anything or knowing anything or being special. When water freezes, there is no meaningful way of saying, well, it froze because of that molecule. it might start somewhere because it has to kind of nucleate, and then the crystal, the ice crystal sort of grows. You do another on another day, it would have started somewhere else. So, it's kind of irrelevant where it starts. The fact is it's going to happen as soon as you get to the freezing point of water. So, there is that emergent behavior that is predictable, that is rule bound, but that is not in any way sort of coming from what this particular thing does or what this particular thing does. And there are principles like this operating in biology, and we've come to recognize that more and more. And in fact, there are people who I think convincingly argue that we could and should understand some aspects of evolution this way, that it's interactions between organisms, or we could describe it at some level as interactions between genes and different variants of genes, but there is a collectivity to it. So I actually think that the collectivity to some extent that we see in biology, where somehow you get the same thing happening despite all the differences in fine details, is the same kind of collectivity that we see in and have been familiar with for a long time in the physical sciences. And that it's worth bringing these disparate fields together to sort of understand that how those collective processes operate.
Oh, that's wonderful. And gosh, there's just so many things I would like to explore in there, but it makes me think of, I think you quote something about from E. coli to elephants, we're all doing the same thing or something. Maybe you can correct that quote, but I think that's something like that. And that, but then also the very important idea of holding the paradox a bit, because a lot of this can seem like we're saying it's just all regulation, but you're also very careful to say that it's not just like from the collective to the gene, for example, from the cell to the gene. It's actually kind of, we're opening this up to see that it can also be gene to cell. It can be, or, it can be in all kinds of directions. So that there's that kind of rule-based regularity at the same time that depending on whatever the situation is or whatever the creature is, if it's E. coli or an elephant, I don't know, then this is all going to align differently. And how do we develop models to be able to hold all of that possibility at once? Does that make any sense to you, or do you want to
Yeah,
correct me
it
there?
does. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and it sort of clarifies what some of the things I want to say about this, because from what I've just said, the fact that life works using these collective principles, that interactions between whether it's cells or molecules or genes or whatever, there's nothing particularly special about life in that regard, because that's how the whole universe works. That it's a collective process, and you get these emergent behaviors, whether it's freezing of water or whether it's the behavior of a cell. What is unusual actually about living systems, I think, is that there is this, as you say, this interaction between the different levels. That's this constant exchange of information, so that sometimes what happens to just a particular gene, a particular mutation, really does matter to the whole organism. It can send the whole organism off track, but most of the time it doesn't matter. Most mutations don't do anything. Cells don't even recognize them. You can even knock out genes, and this is something that biologists were doing all the time in the 90s. They would think this gene is crucial to this organism. Let's knock it out. Let's stop it working and see what happens. And nothing happened as far as we could tell. The organisms were fine. So most of the time the details don't matter. Some of the time they really do. And the same the other way, that sometimes there are particular kinds of information that the organism really has to attend to, and that will feed down all the way to changing which genes are switched on or off. So that's the unusual thing, that living things seem to have this kind of leakiness between the different layers, so that sometimes it's insensitive to the details, but occasionally it really does matter. The details really do matter at the various levels. That's what makes living things so hard to understand. If they were like the freezing of water, that they were just everything was emergent, we wouldn't fully understand it, but it would be a lot simpler. But they're not. That's what makes them so complicated to understand, but also so wonderful in what they can do. So that's the distinction. But this question of whether they're all doing that in the same way. What's true? I mean, it was Jacques Monod who said, what's true for E. coli is true for the elephant. And he meant it in a very specific way. I don't want to take him too much out of context, but it's kind of, a bit of a mantra in biology that, okay, so we can understand how gene regulation works in E. coli, in the bacterium, and we've understood gene regulation, for example, because that's what mono did. And we now understand that no, we cannot. That is not the way. The way gene regulation works in bacteria is fundamentally different in important ways from the way it works in us or in an elephant. And we can understand why that needs to be so, because it's related to the fact that we have more complex lifestyles than E. coli. We encounter different circumstances. We encounter everyday circumstances that we have never encountered before, that our ancestors have never encountered before, and we have to figure out what to do. And that doesn't tend to happen so much to E. coli. Usually they'll just die if they encounter something different. It does apply to a little bit, but the more complex an organism becomes, the more open, informationally open it needs to be. In fact, the more agency it needs to have in responding to its environment. And in order to get that, you need different molecular principles. So, I think that's sometimes been that idea of monos. It made sense, and sometimes it's right. We all have DNA, we all have proteins, but there are important respects in which it doesn't work. And sometimes that has tripped biology up, that we've assumed that for very good reasons, we'll start with the simplest organisms, but we cannot always assume that what we find out from those organisms is going to apply further up. And in fact, a lot of the things I'm talking about in my book are trying to address that problem of, now that we understand that things don't work in those simple ways, or relatively simple ways, in complex organisms like us. So how do they work? And that's the challenge. And that's where all this stuff about disordered proteins and promiscuous molecular interactions and so on, that's where it comes in. We have to, if you like, evolution has had to find different solutions because it has different problems to address.
This is why I was trying to bring up the immediacy. I'm not an ecological psychologist, but the idea of immediacy is what I'm just trying to point at to here with this Gibsonian or affordance kind of thing. Nothing is generic, right? Your book shows, and yet we are context. We are shared. The context is, so there's both of these we're trying to hold at once. And I guess what I'm trying to, when I was thinking about meaning and purpose, and I just love your book so much for orienting through that. And it connects a lot to caring, which is something I'm thinking about all the time. And I'm thinking of caring as this immediate, primordial, needful freedom kind of thing, right? Not the ethics and the values that becomes more like what the human kind of version of that expression is. All of those are connected in the same way. Many of the things we're talking about here are all different positions of this. But I wonder about that, how that sits with you, of thinking of this almost primordial tension, but also this kind of collaboration or committiness. I don't know what the verb is of committeeing as a kind of caring, right? Because right now we have this metaphor of competition. You talk about metaphors a lot. And I think, what would it be like, just like as a thought experiment, if that metaphor was caring? Just to give an example, I was just walking my dog before I talked to you. And of course, I'm thinking through all your ideas. And I was just, of course, there's something I care about, which was getting back here and making sure I'm, in the right space to talk to you. And there's something she cares about, which is very slowly sniffing the bushes, So there's these systems which seem, I could orient that as competitive, but it's also caring, right? We're caring for different things. And my care for her made me kind of sit with that tension and let her do what she needs to do, because I was ready and I had time. How does that sit with you there in terms of all of this work you've been doing?
It makes me think of the fact that most life, and certainly, essentially, as far as I understand it, all complex life, is symbiotic. It is a collaboration between different entities. We don't even know, for that reason, we don't even have a good definition of biological individuality. There's really interesting discussion about that. What does it mean for what is the individual, in me, because I have the microbiome, but also, I'm totally dependent on interactions and collaborations with my environment, with other living things. So I think it's really good to recognize that collaboration and finding compromises between entities, it has always been central to what biology does. Um, and there's this, there's a real tension because another, it's true that another central aspect of living things since probably the origin of life has been parasitism, that there are parasites, there are, exploiters, there is that kind of competition. But actually, sometimes those distinctions aren't really clear whether something is symbiotic or parasitic. And there are, cases in biology where it's not clear whether, a virus is sort of having this effect or that effect, or it can change. I mean, we see this even at the level, and perhaps especially at the level of the genome, that our genomes are full of DNA that comes from, that we're sure has ultimately come from a viral source. Viruses have, invaded us, if you like, infected us, and inserted their DNA, their genes, into our genome. Some of that can genuinely be regarded as selfish DNA. It's not really genes, but it's selfish DNA in the sense that DNA is very good at replicating itself, and if it was left unchecked, it would screw up our genomes really quickly. And we have a kind of viral DNA immune system in every one of our cells to make sure that that doesn't happen. But by introducing this stuff, this DNA into our genomes, viruses have created reservoirs of stuff with this great word, affordances. And I think, this is something that's really key to biology, even at the level of molecules. I think of our cells, our genomes, as being full of affordances. Our cells are constantly making molecules, small molecules, two little peptides, little bits of RNA that have no clear function. They're being made because, I think, because they have affordances. They might find uses in particular situations. So it's a really interesting sort of interaction that's going on, that we need this stuff. But we don't need it for particular reasons. We need it because we need affordances, because that's the way evolution happens. In fact, that a molecule, a protein might arise, and it has potential uses, and cells and evolution will find a particular use for it, and or they might find several uses for it, and that's the way it works. So I think that we can see that kind of collaboration, that kind of symbiosis, really, and an ambiguity between what's, if you like, good and what's bad, what's parasite and what's, symbiotic, all the way down. And it seems to be absolutely intrinsic to the way life works. And it means that there's this flow of information and flow of matter and flow of DNA and genes and other things between organisms all the time. So I think this too is a profound shift in the way we think about it. It's certainly a shift in the way we think about how evolution works. That it is not enough to think of it's part of the story, but it's not enough to think of it as a whole bunch of entities that are well defined and that are trying to do their own thing and are competing with all the other things that are trying to do, their own thing. It's much more complex than that. It's a continual exchange. It's an ecosystem of, exchange of information and matter all the time, and it's what makes life interconnected in fundamental ways.
That's wonderful. I also love that perspective. And I do think about that a lot, about like the parasites, or just, you watch birds. I like to watch birds or whatever. And sometimes it's such a violent thing where, a bird will steal the birds of another bird. And it's like caring can sound like it doesn't apply to that. But I actually think if you orient through caring, you understand that caring is tense. There's something in your book where you talk about parenting. This is kind of needful freedom is what's bringing this up. But what I'm trying to bring by bringing up parenting is that this caring is very tense. It's not like sometimes you don't have a compromise. It's not that caring means you compromise. It's just, it's a different kind of, I think, primordial feeling than competition. And I see that competition could be better understood through that primordial tension. In the book, you write a lot about this sort of decentralization, and identity itself is like contextual in a way. And that becomes very important once we start thinking of meaning Yep.
Yeah, well, the I think with the question of that you were talking about in terms of parenting, I think that's in the Book of Minds, where I'm
Oh, okay.
thinking I think of the brain that way, because it's a kind of a reason why why we have brains, because our genes can't do it all. Even in the old picture where our genes were sort of calling the shots, and to some extent we could imagine they are doing that more in bacteria. They can't tell us what to do. There's no genomic lookup table for, I'm in this situation, what do I do, genes? And the genes say, oh, well, we need to switch on. It cannot do that. Evolution can't, provide that, even if that was a good solution, which it's not. And so it gives us brains instead. Or it gives us, cognitive systems, perhaps more generally, which are contextual, which work on rules of thumb. And it's probably this is probably the best thing to do, but we don't really know, but let's try it anyway. That's how living organisms work, and it's how they have to work, because we cannot be optimizing all the time. And if you have systems like that, what I said in the book is that if you're going to make a brain, it's going to do more than that. It's going to end up, say, doing things that seem to, this is the thing that puzzled Richard Dawkins. Why do we sometimes behave in ways that are not adaptive? It's because that's got to be the nature of our brains, that they are not going to necessarily adhere to evolutionary imperatives. So they might do things that are destructive. They might do things that mean we're not going to sort of pass on our genes, because they have an autonomy, because they have got to have that autonomy, because it's the only way they can work. I think in a way, the fact that we have brains is a kind of illustration of the nature, the agential nature of, of what we are, that we need to have that agency, that freedom to make choices contextually, and in the hope really that maybe this is the best thing to do. That's what agents are. They're not machines that have a lookup table for what action to take. They are responding in the moment. And what you were saying about immediacy, it's exactly that. Agents are things that are immediate, that have to make immediate decisions in the context that they hope, if you like, will be the right decision. And I mean, certainly I kind of feel there's any parent will be familiar with that sort of, that notion of, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what the best situation, what the best answer is, because there isn't a best answer, but, this is the best I can think to do at the moment. So, it's a good metaphor, but it's probably more than that. And it also comes from, hopefully there, it comes from a sort of, caring background. But I think or caring motivation, but I think we can, like I've said, extend that to the whole notion of there being a valence, there being an emotional response to this, and that being part of the process, a crucial part of that decision-making process. This is something that I think is pretty uncontroversial now in neurobiology, that emotions are a part of what we might think of as our rational decision making process, that without emotions we don't make as good decisions.
I love that you brought in that basically there's many different ways to be, and there's a kind of, that's this openness again of surprise, of the fact that things might not go the way you desire. That's kind of like, I think somewhere you write that that's a price that we sort of pay for keeping the possible destinations we can go open. There is this entropy, there is this unpredictability to it all, which speaks to that it is meaning, not mechanism, per your book. You wrote this really beautiful article, for example, Nautilus, about your own experience, and I wonder if this has opened up ways for you to see the world differently, and also if that's helped you with some of the things that you've had to deal with over the past few years. And you write about it in that article as having helped you. But I wonder how that connects here to what we've been talking about, or if how to fill into that a little bit. if
Well,
yeah.
yeah, sure. So, I mean, this was, as I was coming towards the end of writing this book called How Life Works, I found actually my life wasn't quite working the way it ought to because I had cancer. I had prostate cancer, and it was of a mildly aggressive sort. So, I needed to have something done about it. And I had surgery, and it's, by every means we can see, it's done the trick. So I was lucky to have been able to do that. But during the time that, and certainly before, knowing exactly what stage it was at and what treatment might I would then be facing, it was absolutely a time for thinking about mortality and what that means, and our being our the time we have here, and what that's really about, and what is our real nature. um so it focused my thinking about that, and I guess the way it seemed to me to think about it is, clearly we're not our material nature, because that's changing all the time. What is it that is persisting, and what is it that disappears when we no longer persist? And you can think about it as a kind of pattern of information, because, in a sense, that's what's being imprinted on these atoms. And that in itself is a really weird thing to think about, because it seems like a disembodied thing, but actually, it requires materiality. But thought about that way, it made me think, well, then, given that it's patterning, given that it's a temporary sort of coming together of the material universe in this sort of sustained pattern until it is no longer sustained, um that information and that patterning doesn't just disappear with us. We leave imprints of that information that would not have existed had this particular cluster of, information not come together in this kind of, temporary little whirlwind, is what I thought about there. And
Whirlpools of meaning. It's such a beautiful phrase.
yeah, because that's what we're doing. As I say, that as living things, we're creating meaning. But it helped me to make sense, for example, of how it can be that something that someone has done, because they were one of these whirlpools at some point in time, they have imprinted something on the universe that is still there, like, Bach's music, Beethoven's music, like a book, that is in some very real sense still a part of that information, still a part of what it is, of what they were. Um, and I don't think it's a kind of, just a romantic way of thinking about it. It is literally that information exists and continues to have an effect on the world because, it came from that person as a sort of, whirlpool of meaning. So, and this is the thing that has always kind of astonished me, I suppose, that information can persist and can continue to have meaning. Some years ago, I went to a performance of Beethoven's Diabelli Variations, piano pieces that he composed late in his life, played by Igor Levit, who is one of that is almost his signature kind of piece. And so it was extraordinarily good. I knew nothing about it in advance. And I was taken by surprise halfway through, just to find tears streaming down my face, and I was kind of thinking, what is this about? And it felt to me like it was about, it was the meaning making that went into that music was, making meaning for me, and that communication is something that was very real, it is extraordinary, and is a real expression of how that whirlpool of meaning that was Beethoven somehow, created in the world something that persists. And so I did find some kind of solace in that, because it's going to happen. I was lucky that it didn't happen to me at that particular time, but it's going to happen at some point, that we need to sort of confront the fact that this is in our nature, that we're not here forever. And for me at least, as someone who doesn't have a religious belief, perhaps has a kind of spiritual outlook, but I don't, but it's not rooted in any religion. This felt to me like a useful way of thinking about what it is that what is how to think about our our presence here, how we've come into being, how how amazing it is, and we should remember it is that you know bits of the universe have come together to do these things, to have these conversations, atoms talking to each other. How on earth does that happen? That's really the mystery at the bottom of, trying to understand biology. And if we don't recognize that, then we're really not acknowledging the true depth of the mystery of living things.
It's beautiful. I have to say, I've had a similar experience with Beethoven. And also, I had a similar experience reading your article, to be honest. It kind of teared me up. And I think there's two things. I mean, also, I want to say, also, it was very intellectually stimulating to think about diseases as other ways cells are being, too. I just want to add that, too. But also, more to this conversation, since we're coming to a close, that idea that we were talking about where nothing is generic, that relates to this philosophy of love kind of idea of everything is unique and nothing can be replaced because it's all in the sense of context, we're creating what's possible and that context continues. I think that's in your book a lot, right? That and in what you just said, that look at how much of your book and me and all of us are talking about these people who did work who lived so long ago, and it's oriented us. And your work, I think, will orient other people in the future. And that feels to me so important and so meaningful. But also, a few times here, we've danced around ideas of mysticism or wonder as if those are, we should be, not you haven't, but people tend to be sort of ashamed of those words. But if you look at it through this different frame, I almost think those words become necessary because we don't like that is kind of what's happening here, this contextual continuance. How can we not be awed by that? And finding a way not to feel guilty or embarrassed about that feels like part of this project too, and something I want to thank you for because I think your work is helping people be able to deal with that because it's hard. I just wanted to say that, and you can respond in any way if anything comes up, but mostly I'm just saying thanks for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's lovely to hear. Um, I mean, I suppose one thing it speaks to me is that, it's a kind of curious thing that science is trying to do because it's trying to make generic what is actually always unique. Every moment in the universe is unique. And, science is about finding patterns and regularities in that help us to understand generically how things happen. But there's still going to be that tension about the uniqueness of every moment and every part of the universe. And I think uh, what's crucial in that for me is that there has been this notion, you still hear physicists in particular say this a lot, that, well, yeah, but it's all kind of, it's all predictable because it's only atoms, interacting. So if we knew there's an idea that goes back to Laplace at least.
Yeah, I
If we
do.
knew, where every atom was and what every interaction was, we could predict all of the future. And increasingly, I think people, including some physicists, are realizing that that is not the nature of the way things happen. That there is a kind of computational irreducibility, is sometimes the way it's talked about, that means you cannot know, you cannot predict until it happens. You cannot predict without actually letting everything in all its detail play out, basically, letting history happen. And what's more than that, and this is crucial to understanding living things, is that they become they become a nexus of causation in what happens, that there's an open-endedness to it, that when something develops, it actually creates new possibilities for what can come afterwards. This is, a way. This is something that we see in evolution, that when there is some ramping up of complexity, entirely new things become possible for what life can do that simply weren't present in with simpler organisms and were not predictable. Well, even in a technical sense, were not predictable. There's an open-endedness to the way the universe unfolds, and certainly to the way living things unfold. So I feel there's, there's something about that, the uniqueness you were talking about, in that it's not just one thing after another that we can't predict. It's actually new possibilities. And there's something very exciting, I find, in that aspect of life.
Me too. Literally nothing is replaceable, which is just a fascinating thing to meditate on. But I guess before we go, it's love and philosophy. I have to at least say the word love. I'm not sure if I have yet. And I always ask if you have any experience of love, or if that word relates at all to any of this in any way that you want to share. If there's any experience of love, or if that word means anything to you in the context of all this we've been talking about.
It's a great question. I wish I had something more profound to say about it, but I guess I feel that it's one of those words that is talking about something real. And I think it worries me that there's a tendency sometimes in biology to talk in as if language. That we can talk as if we were conscious, or as if we were agents, or as if we were loving entities. And it's really important to say, no, that is in the, that those are aspects of reality that ultimately we might want to think about, we might want to address. Where does that come from? I think that understanding, recognizing a continuity of the characteristics that living things have, including the ability to feel love, recognizing an evolutionary continuity in that doesn't diminish them. It actually, on the converse, it forces us to recognize them as real things that have evolutionary roots that we can understand and explore. And by doing so, we are not explaining away those characteristics. We are actually recognizing them as real and valuable and worth taking seriously.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for this talk and for spending some time with me today.
Oh, it was a great pleasure, Andrea. Thank you.
Have a great day there.
Thank you.